He had commanded empires with a single word. He had silenced war councils with the weight of one glance. He had ridden into battle before the first frost of his 17th year, and returned with the enemy's banner draped over his saddle, his chest painted in the red of victory and sacrifice. Every lord in Arthenvale bowed when Julian Maximus entered a room. Every soldier straightened at the sound of his boots on stone. Even the wind, it was said, held its breath when the Alpha King lifted his hand. And yet, on the morning of the sovereignty rite, the ancient ceremony in which the royal Griffin acknowledged the rightful ruler of the realm, the most powerful man in the known world stood in the center of the great courtyard, with his palm outstretched, his dark eyes burning with authority, his voice rolling like thunder across marble and sky. And the Griffin looked right past him. It was not a small humiliation. Nothing about that moment was small. The courtyard of Arthenvale's royal seat, the Iron Spire Palace, held 500 witnesses. Lords and ladies in silk and armor, advisors clutching scrolls they would never need to reference again. Servants pressed against the far walls, forgetting that they were supposed to be invisible. The morning light slanted gold and sharp across the open air, cutting between the towers like something sacred, and in the center of it all stood the royal Griffin, Orin, the Ancient One, the last of his line, with his wings half spread and his golden feathers catching fire in the sun. Orin was not a creature of metaphor. He was real in the way that mountains are real, in the way that the sea at its deepest is real. He stood 12 feet at the shoulder, with the body of a lion thick as 3 war horses, and the wings of an eagle that, when fully opened, could blot the sun from the courtyard entirely. His beak was the color of old bone. His eyes were amber and deep, and impossibly old, as though he had seen every king who had ever lived, and had quietly decided what he thought of each of them. He had bowed for every single one, until now. Julian Maximus had spoken the binding words. He had pronounced them correctly, precisely, with the full force of his lineage behind every syllable. The ancient tongue of the first kings was not a language anyone alive spoke in daily conversation. It was a language of power, of covenant, of unbreakable declaration. And Julian had spent 3 years studying it with the oldest scholar in Arthenvale's memory, a man who lived in the Eastern Tower and smelled perpetually of candle smoke and crushed herbs. He had not taken the preparation lightly. He had taken nothing in his life lightly. He said the words. The wind moved. Orin's wings opened like the arms of something enormous waking from sleep. Every person in that courtyard leaned forward, and then Orin turned his great amber gaze away from the king and fixed it on the far end of the courtyard, near the stable entrance, where the servants clustered together like birds on a wire. The silence that followed was different from any silence Julian had experienced. It was not the silence of reverence or the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of 500 people trying to process something that did not fit into the world they understood. Julian's jaw tightened. He was not a man who showed his interior life easily. He had trained himself out of it the way other men trained themselves out of flinching, slowly, painfully, over years of necessity. His face remained composed. His posture did not change. He was, in every visible way, still the king. But his hand, still extended, still open, trembled once. He spoke the binding words a second time. The words were louder now, not shouted. Julian Maximus did not shout, not in public, not when it would betray something. But the volume carried in them a warning, the kind of warning that generals understood and enemies had learned to fear. The kind of warning that said, I have asked once. I will not be in the habit of asking again. Orin did not move. His gaze had not shifted. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. A murmur began to move through the crowd like a tide coming in. It was quiet at first, barely more than breath disturbed by the sound of lips parting on unfinished thoughts. But it grew. It always grew, in crowds. That was the nature of uncertainty. It multiplied. Lord Varen, standing at Julian's left, stepped forward slightly and said, very quietly, "Your Majesty." "I am aware," Julian said. 2 words, flat as a blade laid on stone. He looked out across the courtyard to where the Griffin's gaze had settled. His eyes moved over the gathered servants near the stable door, and he saw, not immediately, because she was not the kind of woman who immediately announced herself, a young woman standing slightly apart from the others. She was small in the way that still things are small. Not fragile, not diminished, simply contained within herself, as though she had learned long ago that the space she occupied was enough. She wore the deep red of the stable workers, the color that marked the lowest-ranking servants of the palace, those who tended horses, cleaned tack, hauled feed and water in the long cold of pre-dawn. Her hair was white. Not gray, not silver, but white, the white of new snow before it has been touched by anything, and it fell loose past her shoulders, which was unusual for a stable hand. Most kept their hair bound tight against the dust and the work. She was looking at the Griffin, not at the king, not at the spectacle of the ceremony or the gathered lords or the impossible golden creature in the center of it all. She was looking at Oren the way you look at something you have been quietly conversing with for a long time, and you are simply continuing the conversation. Julian watched her for a moment he could not later account for. In the middle of everything, the murmuring crowd, the advisors shifting in their unease, the ancient ceremony unraveling in real time in front of 500 witnesses, he watched her. Then the guards moved. 3 of them, at the unspoken signal from Lord Varen, began moving toward the stable entrance. It was not violent, not yet. It was the kind of movement that preceded violence, the kind of careful, deliberate advance that said we are going to control this situation before it becomes something we cannot control. The servants scattered like startled birds. Most of them. All of them, except the young woman in red. She watched the guards come. She did not flinch. She did not step back. And then she did something that would be recounted in every corner of the kingdom for years afterward. She breathed. That was it. That was all. She simply drew a long, slow breath, and then she lifted her eyes from the advancing guards and looked at Oren directly, and something moved between them that had no name in any language Julian knew. It was not a command. It was not a plea. It was... He would try to describe it later, alone in his study with a cup of wine gone cold beside him. It was like watching 2 people who had not seen each other in a long time, recognizing each other across a crowded room. A reunion. An understanding that required no words, because the words had already been said, long ago, in some time neither of them remembered but both of them carried. Oren moved. He moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, each paw placed with the precision of something that understood the weight it carried. He crossed the courtyard in 6 slow, deliberate steps, his wings folding back against his body, his great amber eyes fixed on the young woman in red. The guards stopped. Even the guards stopped. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because you do not step between a royal griffin and whatever it has decided to move toward. You simply do not. Oren stopped before her. His shadow covered her entirely, blotting out the slanted morning light so that she stood in a pool of shade, looking up at something that could have ended her existence with a single movement of one paw. She looked up at him. Calm. Utterly, impossibly calm. And Oren, the royal Griffin of Arthenvale, the living symbol of sovereignty and sacred power, who had not bowed to a king in the full history of the ceremony, bent his front legs and lowered his head until his beak nearly touched the stone. He bowed. The silence that fell then was absolute. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of 500 people who had stopped breathing at the same moment, who had stopped everything, who were all suspended in the single instant of realizing that the world they had understood until this morning was not quite the world they were living in. Julian Maximus stood at the center of the courtyard with his hand still slightly extended, and felt something move through him that was not rage, though it had every right to be rage. He had been publicly passed over by the most sacred symbol his kingdom possessed. He had spoken the ancient words twice, in front of witnesses, and been ignored both times. If he had been a man made only of pride, he would have been destroyed in that moment. If he had been made only of anger, the guards would already be moving toward that young woman with very different intentions. But Julian Maximus had not survived 27 years. A contested succession, 2 assassination attempts, and the slow education of governing a kingdom by being only one thing. He was many things, and on the rare occasions when he allowed himself to be honest about it, he knew that the most important thing he was curious. He was deeply, desperately, furiously curious about the young woman in the stable servant's red, who had done without words what he could not do with every weapon of authority he possessed. He closed his hand. He lowered his arm. He looked at Lord Varon and said, in a voice that carried only to the man beside him, "Bring her to me." Her name was Sasha Moonfist. He discovered this 20 minutes later, in the smaller receiving chamber off the main hall, where he had retreated with Lord Varon and 2 senior advisors, and shortly afterward, the young woman herself. She came in with 2 guards at her back, not because she had required convincing, but because that was simply how things were done in Arthenvale when the king summoned someone. She came in straight-backed and unhurried, her white hair still loose, her red work clothes unchanged. Julian was standing near the window when she entered. He had taken a moment before her arrival to reassemble himself into the version of Julian Maximus that the world was permitted to see. The one built from stillness and authority, the one that did not reveal what it was thinking. He was very good at this. He had been doing it since he was 13 years old. He turned when she entered and studied her with the same focused attention he had applied to military maps and treaty negotiations and the faces of men who were trying to deceive him. She was younger than he had assumed. Perhaps 20, perhaps 22 at most. Her skin was very pale. The kind of pale that came from years of early mornings and enclosed spaces rather than from any kind of fragility. There was a smear of something, oil perhaps, or feed dust, along her right forearm that she had clearly not had the chance to clean. Her eyes, he noted, were gray. Not silver, despite everything about her that suggested silver. A quiet, steady gray, like lake water before rain. She met his gaze without apparent difficulty. She was either very brave or very calm, or both, and he had not yet determined which. "Your Majesty," she said. She inclined her head. It was technically a respectful gesture, but there was nothing in the way she did it that suggested fear, and it was the absence of fear that interested him most. "Your name," he said. He did not phrase it as a question. He rarely phrased things as questions. "Sasha Moonfist." A pause. "I work in the East Stables, under Master Helvin. I've been assigned there for—" "I know where you work," he said. Which was almost true. He had asked Varon, in the 3 minutes between the end of the ceremony and this meeting. Varon had confirmed. East Stable hand, 3 years in palace service, no notable record, no notable family history on file. A ghost in the records of the palace. The kind of person who existed in the margins of every large institution. Present enough to keep things functioning, invisible enough to never be seen. Until today. "What you did in the courtyard," he said. He waited. She did not immediately fill the silence. He noticed that. Most people filled his silences. They felt the pressure of them and rushed to answer before the question was fully formed, and in doing so, they often said more than they meant to. She let the silence sit there between them like something she was entirely comfortable with. "I didn't do anything, Your Majesty," she said at last. Lord Varen, standing behind Julian's left shoulder, made a small sound of disbelief. "You calmed the Griffin," Julian said. "I didn't calm him." There was no defensiveness in it. She was simply being precise. He was never distressed. He was paying attention to something. To me, I suppose. I didn't call him or signal him. I just breathed. I've learned that sometimes breathing is enough. Julian studied her. "You've interacted with the Griffin before." She hesitated. It was the first hesitation he had seen from her, and it was brief, but he caught it. "He visits the east pasture sometimes, in the early mornings," she said, "before the court is awake. He walks the outer wall, and sometimes he comes to the fence. I've been there when he does. We've spent time near each other." "Spent time," Varen repeated from behind Julian's shoulder, his tone oscillating between skepticism and something that sounded like alarm. "The Royal Griffin has been—" Julian raised a hand without turning. Varen stopped. "Does he come to other stable workers?" Julian asked. "Not that I've seen," Sasha said. She did not say it with any pride or wonder. She said it the way you describe weather, as a fact about the world that you have simply observed. Julian was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the courtyard was clearing. The ceremony would need to be rescheduled, postponed, explained. There would be letters to write and councils to hold, and whatever the political equivalent of managing a narrative was. He was aware of all of this. It lived in a separate part of his mind, the part that was always tracking the administrative reality of being a king, the part that never fully rested. But a different part of him was here, in this room, looking at this woman and trying to understand something that did not have a shape yet. "The binding words," he said. "Do you know what they are?" "I've heard of them," she said. "They're the words the king speaks during the sovereignty rite. The words of the First Covenant." "The First Covenant," he said. "Which says what?" She looked at him steadily. "That the Royal Griffin recognizes the one who holds the realm's heart. That sovereignty is not granted by blood or force, but by, the old texts say, by the weight of what you carry in the silent places. I read about it once. In a book from the library. I used to go to the palace library on my rest days." Another pause. "I wasn't sure if that was permitted, but no one ever stopped me." He had not known that servants used the palace library. He would need to ask someone whether that was policy or oversight. He filed it away. "You read the records of the First Covenant," he said. "I read most things," she said simply. "I've always found it easier to understand a place by reading about it than by asking people. People usually tell you what they think you want to hear." There was something in that sentence that landed differently than she had probably intended. Or perhaps she had intended it entirely. He found that he could not yet tell. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Varen and the two advisors. "Leave us." Varen began to object, but Julian's expression forestalled it. The advisors filed out. The door closed behind them with the particular softness of a man disapproving loudly through silence. Julian sat down for the first time that morning, in a plain chair near the window, not the formal seat at the head of the table. Sasha moved to sit across from him in the same understated way, hands in her lap, gray eyes calm. "The Griffin didn't bow to me," he said. Not a complaint. Not an accusation. Something between a statement and a question. "No," she agreed. "Do you know why?" "I don't think Orin responds to commands," she said. "I think he responds to presence. To whatever a person is carrying, internally." Not their title or their power. Something deeper. A pause. He's very old. I think he has his own understanding of things. Julian looked at the window. The light had shifted from the sharp gold of ceremony to the ordinary light of mid-morning. I've spent 3 years preparing for that ceremony, he said. The language, the history, every account since the founding. I know, she said. Everyone in the palace knows. Word moves through servant corridors. A small pause. I thought it was admirable, that you took it seriously. And yet Oren has his own reasons. That isn't entirely a reflection of you. Not entirely, he repeated. You're being careful with your words. I'm always careful with my words, she said without apology. He almost smiled. What is it a reflection of, then, if not entirely of me? She looked at him, really looked at him, in the way that few people did. Most gazes broke against the title before they reached the man beneath. Sasha looked as though the title were a coat he was wearing, and she was trying to see the shape of the person inside it. I don't think Oren is interested in authority, she said. I think he's interested in openness, in the willingness to receive, rather than only to command. And I think... She paused. The kind of presence you've built, Your Majesty. It's real, and it's extraordinary, but I think Oren hears what's behind it. And what's behind it is very guarded, very defended, and he doesn't know yet what he's being defended against. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird called once, and was silent. Julian Maximus, who had not been spoken to so directly since his mother died when he was 14, sat with that for a long time. You work in the East Stables, he said at last. Yes. You'll be reassigned, he said. To the palace. I want to continue this conversation. It was not a question. It was barely even a request. It was the only way he knew how to want things, declaratively, forward-facing, as though the decision had already been made and reality simply needed to catch up. Sasha looked at him steadily. All right, she said. She did not say thank you. She did not look grateful or overwhelmed or ambitious. She looked, if anything, simply present, as though this development were one more thing she was paying careful attention to. He stood. The meeting, by all visible indicators, was over. One more thing, he said. She had risen too, and he was aware suddenly of how she stood, with a kind of rooted quietness, like a tree that has grown used to wind. The Griffin, the name you used. Oren. She looked at him. That's not his official name, Julian said. In the palace records, the Griffin has been listed simply as the Royal Griffin, or occasionally as the Elder, for 500 years. I know, she said, but that's what he told me his name was. Julian looked at her. Not in words, she added. He didn't speak. But there are ways of knowing things that don't require words. She said it simply, without mysticism, in the way that you might say that water is cold when you touch it. He said nothing. She turned and moved toward the door, and he watched her go with the particular focused attention of a man who has just encountered something he does not yet understand, and has decided, in the full depth of his nature, that he is going to understand it. The door opened. She paused. Your Majesty, she said without turning. The ceremony. It can be rescheduled. But if you go into it the second time the same way you went into it the first time, Oren will do the same thing. A pause. I could help, she said. If you wanted. I don't know if I can make him bow, but I think I could help you understand what he's listening for. She left. Julian stood at the window for a long time after, watching the courtyard below where the last traces of the morning ceremony were being swept away by servants who had not been there to see any of it. He thought about the strange young woman with white hair and lake gray eyes and oil on her forearm, who had just told him, with no apology and no softening, that his greatest armor was also his greatest blindness. He thought about the way she had looked at the Griffin, the way the Griffin had bowed. He thought about his mother, who had been the last person to tell him the truth, and how long ago that was, and how much he had missed it. He ordered the ceremony rescheduled for the following month. He went to the East Stables that evening on the pretense of checking his personal horse, a gray stallion named Iden who was in excellent health and required no checking. He arrived to find the stalls quiet in amber late-day light, and Sasha at the far end of the corridor, brushing down a young roan mare with the slow, circular attention of someone who was not in any hurry. She was humming something low and wordless, talking to the mare too, in a murmur too low to hear. The mare was deeply still under her hands, head dropped, eyes half closed. She turned when he came in. She looked at him without surprise, which was characteristic. "Your Majesty," she said. "I'm not here officially," he said, which was an unusual thing for him to say. He was always officially somewhere. "All right," she said, and turned back to the mare. He walked the length of the stable slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He ran a hand along Iden's flank, not because Iden needed it, but because the warmth and solidity were grounding. "How long have you been here?" he said. "In Arthenvale." 3 years. I came from Crestfall, in the eastern borderlands, near the Moor Passage. Why did you leave?" "There wasn't much left to stay for. My grandmother died. She was the last of my family. The town was... It wasn't cruel to me. But I was always a little outside of it. The white hair, for one thing." Julian heard the understatement and felt something move in him that was not pity, but was close to recognition. "Did she know about you and the Griffin?" he asked. The brush stopped moving. "She knew about my family's history. She told me stories, that our line was old, that there had been women in our family long ago who were bonded to sacred creatures. She called it the silence gift, the ability to speak without words, to listen without ears." A pause. "I always thought they were the kind of stories grandmothers tell to make you feel like you belong to something larger than yourself." "But they weren't," Julian said. She resumed brushing. "No, they weren't." He moved to the stall nearest her and leaned against the wood. He did not try to fill the space. "What was she like?" he asked. A small, private smile crossed Sasha's face. The first genuine smile he had seen from her, the kind that makes a face entirely alive. Fierce, small as a sparrow, and absolutely without patience for nonsense. She kept bees, 14 hives. She said the bees taught her everything she knew about listening. The smile softened. "I miss her every day." Julian was quiet. The stable breathed around them, the slow warm breath of horses, the smell of hay and leather and summer straw. "My mother died when I was 14, he said. It simply emerged. She was the only person in the palace who spoke to me like a person, not a title. I've spent 13 years since then being very certain about what I was and what I was for." Sasha had stopped brushing. Her gray eyes were steady and warm in the amber light. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "Not being certain," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "That sounds exhausting." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. He left the stables an hour later, having talked about small things. Horses, the borderlands, a herb his cook used that was common in Crestfall, the acoustics of the corridor at night. Small things that accumulate into something larger without your awareness, the way stones build a wall before you've noticed you're building one. He walked back through the palace in the early dark and thought about what it would mean to be a little less certain about what he was. He found to his own confusion that the thought did not frighten him. Sasha was moved into a chamber in the eastern wing of the palace. Small, functional, better than the shared servants' dormitory, but modest enough that it would not draw too much comment. Her official role was designated, somewhat vaguely, as Griffin Liaison, a title that Lord Varen invented with poorly concealed displeasure, and that would appear in the official records for the first time in the history of the Arthenvale court. The court noticed. The court always noticed everything. Within a week, there was murmuring in the corridors and halls, the particular kind of murmuring that moves through a palace like weather, shifting direction, gathering force, dispersing and reforming. A stable girl elevated to the king's circle, the Griffin Liaison, she who had done what the king could not. Sasha moved through it with the same calm that she seemed to bring to most things. She was not oblivious to it. Julian watched occasionally from a careful distance, and he could see her register the looks, the pulled-back conversations, the assessment in the eyes of people who had never considered her before, and were now doing so with uncomfortable intensity. But she did not react to it. She simply continued to be herself in a palace that was not entirely certain what to do with her. Julian told himself that he was spending time with her for practical reasons. The sovereignty rite needed to be rescheduled. She was the only person in the kingdom with actual knowledge of what had happened. This was true. It was also not entirely the reason. They met in the evenings in the archive room off the main library. Julian's private retreat since boyhood, a space he had never brought anyone else to. He told himself it was convenient. The light was good. The shelves contained relevant historical material. The first meeting was about the Griffin. They worked through accounts of previous sovereignty rights and discovered that 2 earlier kings had experienced hesitation from Orin. In both cases, the Griffin had eventually bowed after the king did something unguarded. One had removed his crown. One, according to a small marginal note they nearly missed, had simply wept. He wept, Sasha said, at the ceremony. He had lost his son 3 days prior, Julian said, reading from the margin. He was not composed. And Orin bowed, immediately. They both sat with that. Not the crown, Sasha said slowly. Not the words, the vulnerability. The openness, Julian said. He was remembering what she had said in the receiving room. Can you do that? He understood immediately what she was asking, not whether he could perform vulnerability as a technique, but whether he could genuinely access it. Whether there was anything, underneath the architecture he had built over 13 years, that was still accessible. I don't know, he said. Sasha nodded slowly. That's a better answer than yes, she said. They met again 3 days later, and did not talk about the Griffin at all. Julian came with questions. About Crestfall, about the silence gift, about whether she had always been able to communicate with animals, or if it had developed over time. She told him about the feral dog she had befriended as a child, the horse she had nursed back from a broken spirit over 8 months at the East Stables. She told him about the birds that gathered on her window ledge every morning, which she had not encouraged and could not explain. Things come to you, he said. I don't chase things, she said. I've found that if you stop trying to capture something, you understand it better. He thought about that for a long time after. On the 4th meeting, she asked him what he loved about the kingdom. Not policy or strategy. What felt like home rather than responsibility. He was quiet longer than he expected. Then he told her about the northern highlands above the tree line, where he had ridden alone once before the full weight of kingship descended, where the air was so clear, it felt like drinking something. The festival of deep winter, attended with his mother in plain clothes, the smell of spiced wine and burning cedar. A river in the eastern province he had swum at 17, cold and fast, and absolutely demanding of presence. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he was done she said simply, "You love it very much." "I do," he said. And then, before he could stop himself, "I'm afraid of failing it." The silence that came after that was one of the most honest of his adult life. "What does failing look like to you?" she asked gently. He thought about it. "Leaving it smaller than I found it," he said. "Making choices for power, rather than for the people. Becoming the kind of king who is remembered for surviving, rather than for building something." He paused. "My father was a great king. He built the western aqueducts. He expanded the treaty with the northern clans. He made Arthenvale larger and safer and more prosperous. I've been trying to keep what he built intact mostly, trying to not break it. That's..." He stopped. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said softly. "It's not." He looked at her. There was no judgment in her face. There was simply the same clear, steady attention she gave to everything, and underneath it something that might have been tenderness. He was not used to being looked at with tenderness. He had almost forgotten it was something that could be given. "What would you build?" she asked. He had not been asked that, not in those words, not in any words. He talked for a long time, and she listened. The meetings became a fixture. They both knew it. The court knew it too, and found that knowing both insufficient and deeply interesting. Lord Varen watched from a careful distance with an expression that balanced concern and calculation in approximately equal measure. The other advisors said little directly to Julian about it, but spoke a great deal to each other. Julian was aware of all of this. He was aware of most things. He had been trained from birth to maintain a simultaneous awareness of every conversation and current in a room, to track alliances and frictions and the small movements of power that preceded larger ones. He was aware, in the same way, that something was shifting inside himself that had political implications he had not yet fully mapped. He did not stop meeting with her. On a night in the 6th week, they were in the archive room later than usual, the candles burning low on the table between them. They had been talking about the First Covenant, not its ceremonial requirements but its actual text, which Sasha had found in a manuscript so old that the vellum had gone nearly translucent, and the ink was the color of old rust. They had both been leaning over the manuscript for an extended period, and Julian had not noticed, until that moment, how close they had gotten. He became very aware of it at once. She was not touching him. They were simply both close to the same illuminated page, close enough that when she turned to say something she was not expecting, the proximity, and went briefly still. He did not step back. For a moment, in the warm low light of the archive room, they were simply very near each other, and both of them knew it. And the thing that moved between them in that moment was not subtle and not easily named, but was clearly present for both of them. Then she turned back to the manuscript, and her voice, when she resumed speaking, was only very slightly changed. A little slower, a little more careful. He noticed. He noticed everything she did by then. "The covenant says that the bonded pair, the Griffins recognized, is always two people," she said, her finger tracing the old text without touching it. "Not one. The king and someone the Griffin also accepts. It's not about power. It says here," she translated haltingly, her old language reading still slower than his, but more intuitive. "The Griffin does not bow to the crown alone, but to the joining of the crown with that which the crown cannot carry by itself. The sovereign is not one but two, the one who commands and the one who listens. Together, they hold what neither can hold alone." She stopped. In the silence, the candle nearest her guttered once and steadied. Julian read the passage himself in the original language. He read it twice. "That's not in any of the official accounts," he said. "No," she agreed. "I think someone removed it, or it simply stopped being copied when it became inconvenient." He sat back. He thought about what it meant. He thought about it for a long time, turning it over in the same way he would turn over a piece of intelligence before acting on it, looking for the angles, testing the weight. And then, underneath all the political and historical implications, He let himself simply feel what it meant. That the ancient text had described, centuries before either of them were born, something that was true. That the Griffin had not chosen her over him. He had chosen them, both of them, because they were the two halves of something the kingdom needed. That perhaps fate was not an imposition, but a recognition. He looked at Sasha. She was looking at the manuscript, but her hands were still, and her jaw was set with the particular stillness of someone who is managing a complicated interior. "Sasha," he said. She looked up. Her gray eyes were luminous in the candlelight. He did not say what was forming in him. Not yet. It was too new and too large, and the archive room, despite everything it had become for them, was still in the palace. And the palace had its rhythms and its observers, and its particular way of making intimate things into political events. But he let the moment stand. He let her see it in his face. The thing he had stopped hiding from her weeks ago. The warmth and the recognition and the particular kind of looking that has only one name. She held his gaze. She did not look away. And in her face, in the steadiness of her gray eyes and the slight, almost imperceptible softening around her mouth, he saw it returned. "We should schedule the ceremony," he said at last. His voice was low. "Yes," she agreed, just as low. Neither of them moved for another long moment. The candles burned. It happened 2 days later, in a corridor near the East Wing. Julian was returning from the morning briefing with his military commanders, a session that had covered the western border dispute with the Valric Confederation and the preliminary intelligence reports from 3 different regions of the kingdom. And he was walking with 2 guards and the general of the standing army, still in the tail end of the conversation, when one of his personal attendants appeared around the corner at a near run and stopped short at the sight of him. Julian knew immediately that something was wrong. He had been reading faces under stress for 27 years. "Your Majesty," the attendant said, and something in his expression, in the tightness around his eyes and the particular pallor of his face, made Julian's hand move instinctively to the hilt of the sword he was not wearing. "What is it?" Julian said. "There's been—" "A report came to Lord Varen's office, Your Majesty, from one of the household watch, regarding the Griffin liaison. The phrase Griffin liaison should have been administrative. It should have felt bureaucratic, even slightly absurd. In that moment, in the corridor, with the attendant's pallor and the word regarding used in that particular way, it did not feel either of those things. "Tell me," Julian said. The attendant told him. The intelligence was fragmented, as it always is early. An overheard conversation, a name in an informant's report, a pattern in the movements of 2 Sovereignty Council members over the past 10 days. What was clear when the fragments assembled themselves was this. Certain men in the palace had concluded that Sasha's connection to the Griffin was dangerous, not to the kingdom, to their position within it. They intended to remove her from the king's proximity under the guise of inquiry, and to use her bond with Orin as leverage for their own ends. Julian stood in the corridor, with his face arranged in the expression his guards knew to mean he was processing something at speed and had not yet reached the other side of it. When the attendant finished, Julian said, "Where is she now?" "In the east courtyard, Your Majesty. She goes there in the mornings, sometimes when Orin—" Julian was already moving. He moved quickly through the palace. Not running. He never ran inside the palace. It was the kind of thing that caused panic in a building full of people who read the king's body language the way sailors read weather. But walking at the edge of running, taking the short route through the servants' corridor, the back staircase, the passage to the outer complex. He heard it before he saw it. Not shouting. There was no shouting. That was what was so controlled and therefore so dangerous about what was happening. There were simply voices in the east courtyard, voices that had the quality of authority being exercised quietly, and when he came through the courtyard gate he saw them, 5 men, 2 of whom he recognized from the lower council, 3 of whom were palace guards who reported not to his personal command, but to the watch captain, a man named Aldris who had always been Lord Varen's creature. They were arranged in a loose semicircle that was not quite a confrontation, but was very close to one. And in the center of the semicircle, standing with her back to the east wall, and her face turned toward the sky, was Sasha. She was not cowering. He understood immediately that she was not going to cower. She was standing with the same grounded stillness she always had, watching them with the clear gray eyes that did not perform fear, because she had decided, somewhere in the making of herself, that fear was not something she would allow to make her smaller than she was. But she was outnumbered, and her back was to a wall, and the men around her had the practiced ease of people who had done versions of this before, and found it manageable. Above the courtyard, banking in a slow circle against the morning sky, was Orin. His wings caught the sun. His amber eyes, visible even from that height, were tracking the scene below him with the focused attention of something that understood exactly what it was witnessing. Julian came through the gate, and the shape of the situation changed immediately. He watched it change. The 2 counselors turning, the guards shifting, the specific quality of attention that moved through a group when the most powerful entity in the room arrived. One of the counselors, Lord Varen, a man who had been on the council since Julian's father's reign, began composing an expression that would explain why this was not what it appeared to be. Julian did not give him the opportunity. "Step back," he said. 2 words. The same 2 words, approximately, that he had used to silence rooms and end arguments and turn the tide of meetings for his entire adult life. But they sounded different this time. Everyone in the courtyard heard the difference. They were not a king's command. They were something rawer than that. They were what a man says when the thing that was previously abstract is now in front of him, real, with a wall behind it. The guards stepped back immediately. It was reflexive, the way bodies respond to certain frequencies of authority. The counselors moved more slowly, with the deliberate pace of men who needed to manage the appearance of cooperating rather than obeying. Julian crossed the courtyard. He did not look at anyone but Sasha. He reached her and looked at her face. She was looking at him, and in her gray eyes there was no distress. She had not been distressed, he realized. She had been managing, holding the line, doing what she always did, which was simply to be present and grounded and wait for the situation to resolve. But when she saw his face, when she saw what was in his face, the thing he had not managed to fully keep there, something in her own face shifted. A softening, a relief she hadn't known she was carrying. "Are you—" he started. "I'm fine," she said. And then, quietly, with something in her voice that was not quite a smile, but that was close to one, "You came." "Of course I came," he said. And there was no thought in it, no political calculation, no question of whether this revealed too much or positioned him poorly. There was simply the fact of her standing with her back to the wall, and the fact of him standing in front of her now, and the absolute clarity of that. He turned. Lord Varen had found his composure. He was a skilled politician, and skilled politicians can find their composure in almost any situation. "Your Majesty," he said, with the measured concern of a man performing concern, "we were simply conducting a preliminary inquiry into the nature of the young woman's connection to the Griffin, as is the Council's right under the advisory protocols of—" "No," Julian said. Varen stopped. "The advisory protocols do not authorize the detainment of any member of the royal household," Julian said. "The Griffin liaison is a member of the royal household. This conversation is not a preliminary inquiry. It's an unauthorized action, conducted without my knowledge or consent, against a person under my direct protection." He paused. "And it will not happen again." He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. The alpha quality that had always lived in him, That deep, structural authority that was not performed but was simply what he was, in the same way a mountain is what it is, was fully present in every word, stripped of all its usual courtly packaging, and delivered with the directness of someone who had stopped pretending that any of this was negotiable. Farron looked at him for a long moment. Then he bowed. "Of course, Your Majesty." Julian held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he turned away. Above the courtyard, Oren banked once more and came lower. Not landing, not yet, but circling at a height that was a presence, a declaration. Everyone in the courtyard looked up instinctively. Julian placed himself beside Sasha and looked up too. For a moment they stood together and watched the Griffin circle in the morning light. And the courtyard was absolutely silent, and the sun was warm on the stones. "I should have moved faster," he said quietly. To her alone. "You moved fast enough," she said. He looked at her. She was still looking up at Oren, and her face in the sunlight was something he would carry for the rest of his life. The profile of it, the white hair loose, the simplicity of her standing there in the morning with a griffin circling above her and a kingdom's worth of politics attempting to close around her and not a trace of diminishment anywhere in her bearing. He reached out and took her hand. It was not a calculated gesture. He had not planned it, or considered it, or assessed its implications. His hand simply found hers, and her fingers closed around his with a naturalness that suggested this was where they had always been going. Oren circled overhead, and the light was gold, and neither of them moved for a long time. The political fallout was dealt with systematically. Lord Farron was not removed from the council. Julian was too precise a politician for that, but repositioned with such deliberate skill that by the time Farron understood what had happened, the architecture was already complete. Lord Farron, who had suspected something was building and said nothing, received a shorter and sharper reckoning. "She is not a complication," Julian told him, in the amber quiet of his private office. It was both a correction and a warning. Farron accepted it with the honesty Julian had always, despite everything, valued in him. The relationship between them shifted after that conversation, not dramatically, but permanently. Sasha moved through the post-courtyard weeks with characteristic steadiness. She knew the politics involved. She was not naive about the complexity of what had happened or what it meant. She had been in the palace long enough to understand the grammar of power, the way it shifted and reorganized itself when something disrupted the expected order. She asked Julian, once, whether he was worried about continued opposition. "Always," he said. "Opposition is the constant condition of leadership." "And does it," she paused, "does it make you want to close off, protect yourself, become less available?" He looked at her. They were walking in the high gardens, in the evening, which had become a habit of theirs so gradually that neither of them could have identified the moment it became a habit, rather than a coincidence. The gardens were empty at this hour, the formal hedges and the old stone paths lit by the last slanted orange light of the day. "It used to," he said. "For years that was the instinct. Whenever something threatened the stability I'd built, the answer was always to add another layer. More walls, more structure, more distance." He paused. "I'm less interested in that now." She looked at him. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. "Someone showed me that Oren doesn't bow to walls," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh. Not a polite one, not a managed one, but the slightly surprised kind that emerges when something catches you off guard. He had discovered that making her laugh was, unreasonably, one of the things he most wanted to do in the world. "That's very good," she said, still laughing. "I thought so," he said, allowing himself a rare, full smile. They walked. The garden was warm and the light was going and the smell of the late flowering hedgerows was sweet and sharp, and specifically that evening, that particular evening, as though the world were cooperating. He reached for her hand again. She gave it. They walked like that in the last of the light, and the palace rose around them on all sides, and the kingdom stretched out beyond it in all directions. And there was a griffin somewhere beyond the walls, circling slowly in the dusk. And for a few minutes, none of that was the most important thing. The day of the rescheduled sovereignty rite was different from the first in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who had been present for both. It was a smaller gathering to begin with. Julian had made this choice deliberately. The first ceremony had been grand, populous, a spectacle designed to communicate power. The second was quieter. 50 witnesses instead of 500. The High Council, the senior military command, a representative from each of the kingdom's major provinces. No spectacle. Just the ritual itself and the people who needed to witness it. The courtyard was the same courtyard. The morning light was similar. Late spring, early. The sun not quite high enough to be direct. The air holding the last chill of night. Oren was already there when the witnesses gathered, which was itself unusual. In all the records, the Griffin had always arrived after the king. He stood at the far end of the courtyard with his wings folded, and his amber eyes moving over the assembled group. And when Julian entered through the main gate, Oren watched him with an attention that was different from what Julian had experienced at the first ceremony. Deeper, less challenging, as though he already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the question. Julian had prepared differently this time. Not in terms of the words or the formal requirements. Those were unchanged. But in terms of himself. He had spent the week before in the harder discipline of sitting alone and being honest about what he found. The fear he had described to Sasha, larger than he had fully acknowledged. The grief for his mother packed away when he was 14 and never unpacked. The loneliness of a life lived almost entirely in public. He had not resolved any of it. He had simply let it be present as part of what he was carrying. He thought that might be what Oren was listening for, not the absence of weight, but the willingness to feel its actual mass. He walked to the center of the courtyard. He looked at Oren. Oren looked at him. Then, naturally, without planning it, he turned and looked to his right, where Sasha stood slightly apart from the witnesses, in the place she had naturally assumed. Present, but not officially part of the ceremony, because there was no official role for her in the ceremonial texts, because that text had been removed or lost. She was wearing the red that was her color, her white hair loose. Her gray eyes were warm and steady. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that had no name in any language, but was nonetheless completely legible. He turned back to Oren. He spoke the binding words. He spoke them differently this time, not with less authority. He did not think he was capable of speaking without authority. It was too deeply built into him by now, but with authority that was somehow permeable, open. The words carried the same weight, but they carried it the way a strong man carries something he has decided to hold gently, not with less strength, but with a different quality of intention. The wind moved. Oren's wings spread. The light caught the golden feathers and fractured into something that had no business existing in a simple courtyard on a spring morning. And Oren bent his front legs. He lowered his head. The bow was slow and deliberate, and completely different from anything recorded in the historical accounts. Not the quick formal acknowledgement of ceremony, but something deeper, something that felt less like a formality and more like a recognition. Like the moment two people who have known each other for a long time, who have spent time in difficulty together and come through it, meet each other on the other side of everything, and acknowledge what they have made. The witnesses were silent. Julian heard it. The absence of sound, the held breath of the entire assembly, and felt it land in him as something real. He stood straight. He let the moment be exactly what it was. Then he turned and walked to Sasha. He did not take her hand. Not yet. He stood before her and looked at her face in the morning light, and said nothing for a moment, because there was too much to say, and the day was young, and they had time. "You helped me find it," he said, quietly enough that it was only for her. Whatever Oren was listening for. She shook her head slightly. "You found it. kept you company while you looked." He smiled. It was the full smile, the one he kept almost entirely private, the one that transformed his face from the thing the kingdom saw, the severe beauty of it, all dark hair and strong jaw and carefully maintained authority, into something younger and less defended and simply alive. "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He did not announce anything that day. He understood that what had begun between them needed time before he brought the full weight of the kingdom's attention down on it. He did not rush things. He had waited a long time to feel anything this clearly, and he was going to do it right. In the weeks that followed, the palace changed, quietly, in the way genuine change always happens. In the way Julian moved through rooms when she was in them. In the quality of his attention in council meetings, the groundedness that others sensed and could not entirely name. The political resistance regrouped into softer weapons, suggestion, implication, whispered narrative, but Sasha dealt with it in her own way, which was primarily by being so consistently, undeniably herself that every story trying to define her as a threat kept colliding with the reality of her and losing coherence. Meanwhile, she and Archivus, the old scholar who had taught Julian the ancient language, ancient and sharp and entirely unbothered by convention, spent weeks translating documents that had not been read for 2 centuries. What they found confirmed everything her grandmother's stories had suggested. The Moonfist line, named for the pale hands of the first women of that lineage visible in moonlight as they tended the sacred spaces, had been the Griffin-bonded family since before the kingdom took its current form. They had been written out of the official history gradually, through the familiar mechanisms of erasure, omission, renaming, the eventual disappearance of the Griffin liaison role entirely, until the knowledge existed only in borderland stories that sounded like mythology, because no one had the records to prove otherwise. Julian asked Archivus to restore them. All of them. He went that evening to find Sasha and told her what the research had found. She was quiet for a long time. "It doesn't change anything," she said finally. "It changes everything," he said. "Not about who I am." She looked at him steadily. "The records don't make me more real." "No," he said. "But they make you more visible, to the kingdom, to the history of it." She looked out at the evening sky, that particular blue of late spring twilight. "I wish she could see this," she said. Julian said nothing. Some things do not have adequate responses. He simply stayed, which was its own kind of response, and one he had learned, slowly, was often more valuable than words. After a moment, Sasha turned from the window and looked at him with those gray eyes, clear and warm, and she said, "You've been spending a great deal of time in this study." "I have," he said. "Every evening," she said. "Most evenings," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, quietly, with something in her voice that was both tentative and certain, both question and statement, "Is it always going to be this?" He looked at her. He understood the question entirely. It was not about the evenings or the study or the specific geography of their meetings. It was about the larger shape of the thing between them, the question of whether it was going to keep being the careful thing it had been, the thing that lived in archive rooms and high gardens and quiet words, or whether it was going to become something else. "No," he said. "It's not always going to be this." "What is it going to be?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them was warm and low. The palace was settling into the quiet of evening around them, all its ceremony and authority and weight temporarily suspended in the simple peace of a late hour. "What do you want it to be?" he asked. She was quiet. He waited. "I want..." She stopped, started again. "I've never wanted things that were very large," she said slowly. "I grew up small, in a small place, and I learned early that wanting large things was how you ended up disappointed. My grandmother used to say that the truest happiness is the happiness of the immediate. The warmth of the fire, the sound of the bees, the goodness of the meal you're eating right now. She paused. But I think... Her voice was softer now, as though she were telling him something she had not said to herself yet. I think being here, and meeting you, and understanding what the covenant means, and knowing what the research found, I think it's made me able to want larger things. And the largest thing I want, she met his eyes, is this to be real. Whatever this is. I want it to be real, and to stay real. Not a political arrangement or a ceremonial necessity, or a story the kingdom tells itself about what the Griffin chose. Just real. The room was very quiet. Julian moved from his chair and came around the table to her. He crouched down to her level, so that they were eye to eye, and he looked at her face from very close. It's real, he said. It has been real since the stable, I think. Since you told me that creatures don't obey force, but vinculo, connection. He paused. It's the most real thing in my life. She looked at him. Her gray eyes were bright. He reached up and tucked a strand of white hair behind her ear, a gesture so small and so personal that it seemed to exist in a different register from everything else that had happened between them, all the ceremony and history and political complexity, as though it came from a quieter, older place than any of that. I'm not good at this, he said. Being open, available. I've spent most of my life being very good at the opposite. You've watched me try to get better at it, and I don't know if I've succeeded or only become marginally less terrible. She smiled. It was the full smile, the one that made her face entirely alive. You're better than you know, she said. You've always been better than you know. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without ceremony and without a plan, and without any of the orchestration that had characterized most of his important decisions, he kissed her. It was soft, and then not soft. It was brief, and then not brief. It was the thing that happens when two people who have been circling toward each other for months finally close the remaining distance. And when the distance closes, the shape of what was always between them becomes completely clear, and what had been circling becomes simply real. They did not announce it. They did not need to. The palace saw it in everything, in the way he moved when she was present, in the way she looked at him, in the quality of stillness between them that had become its own kind of communication. Courts are attuned to the king's interior life, the way animals are attuned to weather, with the full intelligence of creatures whose survival depends on the accurate reading of signs. The court read this one clearly. The formal announcement came later, worded not as a political maneuver or dynastic arrangement, but simply as what it was. The king had chosen a companion and partner, one whose connection to the kingdom's foundational covenant was documented and real, one whose presence had changed him in ways visible to everyone who worked alongside him. His advisors found the wording somewhat unorthodox. Julian told them it was not negotiable. What he had not expected was the letter from the eastern borderlands. It arrived 6 weeks after the announcement, carried by a courier from the province of Moor Passage, the region near Crestfall, where Sasha had grown up. It was addressed to the Griffin liaison of Arthenvale, in the careful handwriting of someone who had learned to write later in life, and wrote with the considered deliberateness of someone who valued the skill. It was from the people of Crestfall, signed by 14 different names: the village elder, the beekeeper, the miller, several families, children who had apparently signed it in the script of learning. It said, among things, that they remembered Sasha, that they had heard the news, that they wanted her to know that whatever small unkindnesses had been done to her in that small place. And the letter was precise and honest about those unkindnesses, in a way that suggested its authors had been doing some accounting, were things they were sorry for, that they were proud of her, that her grandmother's bees were still tended by a neighbor who had promised to keep them until she could reclaim them if she ever wanted to. Sasha read the letter in the archive room, alone. And Julian found her there later, with her eyes bright, and the letter on the table in front of her, and her hands folded in her lap. He sat across from her and said nothing. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked you." He understood immediately. "Your grandmother?" "Yes." A pause. She didn't have much patience for people who weren't genuinely themselves. She said that pretending was the most exhausting thing a person could do, and that you could always tell who was pretending by watching how they held their shoulders. She glanced at his shoulders, then back to his eyes. "You hold yours differently now than when I first met you." He considered this. "Better? More honestly," she said. Then, "Yes, better." He smiled. She smiled back, and the archive room was warm, and the letter from Crestfall lay on the table between them like something that had been carried a long way and had finally arrived where it was supposed to go. There was a night, deep in the first winter of what the palace had begun to call the Year of the Covenant Restored, when a storm came down from the northern highlands and pressed itself against the palace walls with the full intention of winter. They were in the high study, the one Julian kept on the uppermost inhabited floor of the tower, his since boyhood, arranged according to his own logic, a space he had never brought anyone else to until 2 months ago. Sasha was curled in the large chair by the fire, with a manuscript open in her lap, her white hair loose. He was at the desk working through the quarterly governance reports. The wind pressed at the windows. The fire moved. He put down the report he was reading and looked at her. She was absorbed in the manuscript and had not noticed that he had stopped working. He watched her read in the firelight and felt something move through him that was large and quiet and had no edge to it. None of the sharpness of ambition or the tension of authority. Just the simple, enormous peace of being exactly where you are supposed to be. She looked up, as though she felt the quality of his attention shift. "You're staring," she said. "I am," he agreed. "What are you thinking about?" "I was thinking that this is the thing I didn't know I was missing," he said. "Not the companionship, though that's true, but the simplicity of it. Sitting in a room with a person I love, doing ordinary work. The storm outside, the fire, the ordinary texture of an evening." He paused. "I've spent my entire adult life in the extraordinary. I didn't know the ordinary was this valuable until I had it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You just said that you love me," she said, very quietly. "Yes," he said. "I did." "I love you too," she said. "I have I don't know when it started. Somewhere between the stable and the Covenant manuscript. Or maybe from the beginning. Maybe it was always going to be from the beginning." A pause. "I've been waiting to say it until I was sure you were ready to hear it." He crossed the room and sat on the arm of the large chair, and she shifted to accommodate him, and they sat together by the fire in the storm, her head against his shoulder, his hand finding hers in the easy way of something that has become the natural shape of the world. Outside, the storm was large and northern and complete. Inside the high study, the fire was warm, and it was enough. The ceremony of the formal rededication of the Covenant, the ceremony that archivists had been preparing since the restoration of the historical records, the ceremony that had no official precedent, because the ceremony itself had been erased along with the records, was held in the spring, on a day when the light over Arthenvale had that particular quality of clear sky spring light, the kind that makes everything slightly more vivid than ordinary, as though the world has been cleaned. The courtyard was different from both previous ceremonies. It was neither the grand spectacle of the first, nor the quiet intimacy of the second, but something that combined both, large enough to be witnessed by those who needed to witness it, small enough to preserve the essential quality of what it actually was. 300 people gathered in the warm morning, facing the stone platform at the courtyard center. Julian stood on the platform, He was wearing the formal dress of the Alpha King, the deep slate gray and the silver, the crown that he privately thought was slightly excessive but that tradition required, and he was standing very straight, in the posture that was his natural architecture, the posture of someone who had been trained to occupy a space, as though they owned not just the ground they stood on, but the air above it. But his hands, at his sides, were open. Not in the formal position of command, simply open. Sasha stood beside him. She was wearing white, not the red of the stables, not any livery of service, but her own color, the white that was her nature, a simple gown that moved slightly in the morning breeze. Her hair was loose. Around her throat, on a slender cord, hung a small pendant that had been in the Moonfist family for 4 generations, a piece of amber carved in the shape of a wing. A griffin's wing, her grandmother had told her. From before she was old enough to understand what that meant. She understood it now. Archivist stood to the side of the platform with his scrolls, looking both ancient and alert, the expression of a scholar who has waited a long time to be present at the thing he has been researching. Oren was in the courtyard. He had arrived, as he had the second time, before anyone else, and stood at the far end with the morning light making gold of him, his amber eyes moving over the gathered witnesses with the patient attention of something that has seen many generations of this and understands that each one is both the continuation of a story and the beginning of something new. The ceremony was shorter than anyone expected. Archivist read the restored text of the Covenant, the full text, including the passage that had been removed, the passage about the sovereign being not one but two. He read it in the ancient language first, and then in the common tongue, and his old voice carried it over the morning air with the particular resonance of words being returned to the world after a long absence. Julian spoke next. He had prepared words. He had always prepared words. It was how he worked, the discipline of preparation applied to every significant moment. But when the moment came, he did not use them. He stood before the assembled witnesses of his kingdom, and looked at the woman beside him and said what was true rather than what was prepared. He spoke about Arthenvale, about what it meant to him to govern it, the weight and the privilege of it, the constant negotiation between power and care that governance required at its best. He spoke about the Covenant, not the ceremonial version of it, but the real version, the older one, the one that said sovereignty was not a thing held in isolation, but a thing held between people, between the one who commanded and the one who listened, the one who imposed and the one who received. He spoke about what the past year had taught him, about openness, about the difference between strength that defended itself and strength that could afford to be seen. He spoke briefly. He had spent enough of his life speaking at length. Some things are better when they are short. Then he turned to Sasha and said, in a voice that carried but that was addressed to her, "I have led this kingdom by every tool I had available to me, and I was good at it. I intend to go on being good at it. But I was incomplete in it, and I didn't know it until the Griffin refused me, and you were standing in the stable entrance and you breathed, and something changed." He paused. "The Covenant says the sovereign is two. I believe it. I believed it from the moment I read it. I'm asking you to stand here beside me not because the old text requires it, and not because Oren chose it, and not because the kingdom needs it, though all of those things are true. I'm asking because I choose you. Julian Maximus chooses Sasha Moonfist, wholly and freely, and without any calculation other than that you are the truest thing in my life." The courtyard was quiet. The morning light was gold, and the breeze was soft, and 300 people were holding very still. Sasha looked at him. Her gray eyes were bright with something that was not tears, but was what comes just before them, the pressure of feeling too large to be fully contained. She said quietly, "And Sasha Moonfist chooses Julian Maximus, fully, without reservation, with the understanding that this is not simple and will not always be easy, and that we will have to keep choosing each other, probably every day, in the ordinary texture of ordinary days." A pause. and that I intend to." The silence that followed was different from every other silence in that courtyard's history. It was not the silence of shock or of ceremony or of held breath. It was the silence of completion, the particular quality of stillness that settles over a moment when something that has been moving toward its destination for a long time finally arrives. Then, from the far end of the courtyard, there was movement. Oren walked forward. His paws were silent on the stone, and his shadow moved ahead of him as the sun rose higher, and his amber eyes were fixed on the two people on the platform. He walked the full length of the courtyard in the slow, deliberate way he had moved at the second ceremony, with the measured grace of something that understands its own significance and does not need to perform it. He stopped before the platform. He looked at Julian for a long moment, a look that held something that was not challenge and not submission, but something closer to recognition. The look of equals acknowledging each other. Then he looked at Sasha. Something moved in his amber eyes, ancient, warm, the warmth of a connection that predated the kingdom and would outlast it. He bowed. Slowly, deeply. Not the formal bow of the sovereignty rite, but something more personal than that, something that carried in its specific angle and pace the quality of a genuine gesture between beings who know each other truly. He bowed to both of them, together, in the way the covenant described, to the joining rather than to either part. The courtyard erupted, not in the polite, measured response of an official ceremony, in the spontaneous, human response of 300 people who had felt something real move through the air of that morning and could not contain the recognition of it. Applause and voices, and the particular bright noise of people who have witnessed something true. Julian reached for Sasha's hand. She gave it. They stood together on the platform, while the courtyard found its voice around them, while Oren remained bowed before them in the morning gold, while the Arthenvale spring went on overhead with its clear light and its infinite blue, and something that had been fragmented was whole, and something that had been written out was restored, and something that had been silent was spoken at last. In the weeks after, the kingdom continued its life. It always did. Kingdoms do not pause for love or ceremony or the restoration of ancient covenants. They have harvests and disputes and weather, and the 10,000 daily administrative facts of large numbers of people living in proximity. Julian managed these things with the same focused intelligence he had always brought to them, the governance work that was the constant ground of everything else. Council meetings and military briefings and treaty negotiations and the quarterly review of the province reports. But there were things that were different. He walked through the palace differently. Not with less authority. His authority was not diminished, had not been diminished, would not be. But it had changed its quality, become something more grounded and less defended, less like a wall and more like a foundation. People in the palace noticed. They said, in the corridors, in the kitchens, in the careful whispered conversations of people who live adjacent to power, that he was more present, that he listened more completely in council meetings, that when he made decisions, he made them with a clarity that had always been there, but that now seemed to come from a place that included, rather than excluded. Sasha took on the Griffin liaison role with the full weight of what it actually meant, documented now, formalized, backed by the restored covenant records. She worked with archivists on the historical research and met with Oren in the East Courtyard most mornings, in the quiet before the palace's public life began. In those months she came to understand the silence gift, not as a magical anomaly, but as a refinement of something every living creature carries in some form. The capacity for wordless exchange, for presence that other presences respond to. She was simply more attuned to it than most. The white hair, the pale hands, the grandmother's bees, Oren at dawn. It was all of a piece, the same inheritance passed down like a particular quality of light. She taught some of it to Julian, slowly, over evenings in the high study. Not the gift itself, which was not transferable, but the discipline behind it, the art of listening below the surface of what was being said. He was a gifted student, and it changed him visibly. The way he held council meetings, the way he walked through rooms, the quality of his attention when someone was speaking. Lord Varon, watching from his careful distance, said to Archivus one afternoon, "He's become more of a king." Archivus did not look up from his translation. He was always a great king. Now he knows what greatness is actually for. She changed him. They changed each other, Archivus said. That's the covenant. That's always been the covenant. It was never about a single person holding power. It was always about the partnership. He turned a page. We simply forgot. There was a morning in late summer when Julian woke before dawn and could not sleep. The condition of leadership was incompatible with uninterrupted rest. There were always things moving in the night of his mind. But this morning, he lay still and listened to the breath of the woman beside him. And for the first time in memory, the wakefulness contained no urgency, no calculation, no background hum of responsibility. There was simply the room, the gray light, the warmth, her breathing. Sasha turned in her sleep and settled. Her hand, moving slightly, found his. Her fingers, even in sleep, closed around his. He looked at their hands and thought about the first time he had taken hers. In the east courtyard with Oren circling overhead, and the morning loud with the aftermath of confrontation. He thought about the archive room, the stable, the receiving chamber, every conversation in the weeks of careful accumulation. The ceremony in the spring courtyard and the words she had said, that she intended to keep choosing him in the ordinary texture of ordinary days. He thought about his mother, who had been the last person to tell him the truth, until Sasha walked into a receiving room with oil on her forearm and said, simply and without cruelty, that his armor was also his blindness. He held her hand in the gray quiet and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was not managing something, but simply living it. That the weight he carried was real, but not carried alone, and that the difference between those two conditions was the difference between endurance and joy. He closed his eyes. Outside, at the first hint of light, a griffin called once, high and clear and carrying, the sound of something ancient and alive, and the kingdom of Arthenvale turned over into mourning. Not because a king commanded it, because that is what kingdoms do, when the people who hold them have learned, finally, the oldest truth the covenant had always contained. That the greatest power is not the power that stands alone and refuses to be moved. It is the power that chooses every day to move toward. Julian Maximus chose. Sasha Moonfist chose. They kept choosing. And the kingdom, understanding this at last, exhaled, like a creature that has been holding its breath and has finally been given permission to breathe, and was whole. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.